In the autumn of 1868, the display window of Mercer and Son Funeral Services on Bridge Street in Millston, Pennsylvania, featured the usual arrangement of mourning goods: bolts of black crepe, brass candlesticks, sample books of memorial cards, and 3 urns of varying sizes arranged on a velvet cloth the color of dried blood. But it was the object placed at the center of the display that caused passers-by to slow their steps and linger longer than decency permitted. It was a coffin, not a sample, not a model. A full-size burial case crafted from black walnut, polished to a mirror shine, with silver-plated handles and a brass nameplate affixed to the lid. The plate bore a single name, engraved in the formal serif lettering that Silas Mercer reserved for his most expensive commissions: Eleanor Mercer. The problem, as everyone in Millstone knew, was that Eleanor Mercer was still alive. She could be seen most mornings through the side window of the funeral home, bent over the account books at a small desk cluttered with invoices and burial permits, her brown hair pinned tightly beneath a widow's cap that she had no right to wear. She was 34 years old, childless, and married to a man who had already placed her name on a coffin displayed in his front window, as though she were a completed transaction waiting only for the date of delivery. Silas Mercer, when questioned by the curious or the bold, offered the same explanation to everyone. The coffin was a demonstration piece, a sample of his finest work. The nameplate was merely decorative, a way to show potential clients how their loved ones' names would appear on the brass. The fact that the coffin matched his wife's measurements exactly was a coincidence. The fact that he had visited the Presbyterian cemetery on the eastern ridge of Millston and reserved a plot number 47, in the shaded section near the old stone wall, was simple prudence. A man in his profession understood the value of preparation. The residents of Millston, some 2,000 souls, scattered across a valley of iron foundries, textile mills, and boarding houses that sagged with the weight of coal smoke, accepted these explanations in the way that small communities accept uncomfortable truths. They filed them away in the part of the mind reserved for things better left unexamined. Millstone was a town built on industry and silence. Men died in the foundries, and women died in childbirth, and Silas Mercer was the man who boxed them up and sent them into the ground with the appropriate prayers. He was a necessary figure, and necessary figures were granted a certain latitude, but the coffin remained in the window, and Eleanor Mercer continued to walk past it every morning on her way to the desk where she managed her husband's accounts. And the autumn leaves turned from gold to brown, and the first frost of the season arrived on the 22nd of October. And still, the brass nameplate caught the morning light in a way that suggested permanence. The Mercer Funeral Home occupied a 2-story brick building at the northern end of Bridge Street, where the commercial district gave way to a row of private residences that had seen better decades. The structure had been purchased by Silas's father, Thomas Mercer, in 1841, when Millstone was still a promising settlement on the banks of the Allegheny tributary that powered the first mills. Thomas had been a cabinet maker by trade, but the typhoid epidemic of 1847 had convinced him that coffins were a more reliable source of income than dining tables. He had passed the business to his only son in 1862, along with a set of account books, a collection of embalming instruments imported from Philadelphia, and a reputation for discretion that bordered on the pathological. Silas had expanded the operation with the same methodical precision his father had applied to dovetail joints. He acquired a hearse, a converted carriage with black curtains and silver trim, and hired a driver. He established relationships with the pastors of Millstone's 4 churches, ensuring a steady flow of referrals. He cultivated the appearance of a man who understood grief without being burdened by it, whose solemn demeanor and soft voice provided comfort without the messiness of genuine emotion. He was 41 years old in 1868, tall and thin, with hands that moved slowly and deliberately, as though every gesture were being performed underwater. His hair was receding, his eyes were pale and unremarkable. He wore black suits that had been cut by a tailor in Pittsburgh, and he spoke in complete sentences that seemed to have been composed in advance. Eleanor had married him in 1858, when she was 24, and he was 31, in a ceremony at the Presbyterian Church conducted by the same reverend who would, a decade later, be summoned to preside over her funeral. She had come to Millstone from a farming community in eastern Ohio, the middle daughter of a family that had lost its land to debt and its pride to drink. The marriage to a successful undertaker represented a significant improvement in her circumstances, and she had approached her new role with the diligence of someone who understood that security was a fragile thing. She learned the business, she organized the books, she corresponded with the families, drafting the delicate letters that accompanied each invoice, expressing condolences in the formal language of Victorian mourning, while reminding the bereaved that payment was expected within 30 days. For 10 years, the arrangement had functioned well enough. Silas handled the bodies and the ceremonies. Eleanor handled the money and the records. They lived in the rooms above the funeral home, their domestic life conducted in the constant presence of death, their meals eaten in a kitchen that shared a wall with the embalming room, their sleep disturbed by the arrival of bodies at all hours, their marriage sustained by the shared understanding that survival in Millstone required a certain detachment from the ordinary comforts of life. Then, in the spring of 1868, Eleanor began to experience episodes of weakness. The first incident occurred in April, during the funeral of a foundry worker who had been crushed by a collapsed crane. Eleanor had been standing beside the grave, holding the account book and recording the names of the pallbearers for the invoice, when she suddenly sat down on the wet grass, complaining of dizziness. Silas attributed it to the heat, though the day was cool and overcast. The second episode came in June, when she fainted in the front parlor while meeting with a widow who had come to arrange her husband's burial. Dr. Amos Whitaker was summoned. He examined Eleanor in the upstairs bedroom while Silas waited in the hallway, and when he emerged, his diagnosis was vague but reassuring. A nervous condition common in women of her age, aggravated by the demands of the funeral trade and the thin air of the Allegheny foothills. Rest was prescribed. A tonic was prepared. The bills were added to the household account, but the episodes continued through the summer, growing more severe and more strange. By August, Eleanor was experiencing periods of profound drowsiness that would descend without warning, sometimes lasting for hours, leaving her confused and disoriented when she woke. She began to lose weight. Her handwriting, once precise and controlled, grew shaky and inconsistent. She complained of a metallic taste in her mouth and a numbness in her extremities that made it difficult to hold a pen. Dr. Whitaker adjusted his diagnosis to include a possible digestive imbalance and prescribed a new course of treatment. A powdered medication that Silas mixed into his wife's tea each morning and evening, claiming it had been prepared by an apothecary in Pittsburgh. It was around this time that Silas began making his preparations. The coffin appeared in the window during the first week of September. The plot at the Presbyterian Cemetery was reserved on the 12th. The bolt of black mourning fabric, 12 yards of bombazine, enough for a widow's dress and veil, was ordered from a supplier in Philadelphia on the 18th. Silas explained each of these purchases to anyone who asked with the same calm rationality. The coffin was a display piece. The plot was an investment. The fabric was for a client who had not yet been publicly named. He was an undertaker, after all. These were the tools of his trade. To read anything sinister into them was to misunderstand the nature of his profession. But the residents of Millstone were not the only ones who noticed the accumulating evidence. Lydia Crane noticed as well, and Lydia Crane was not inclined to accept convenient explanations. Lydia Crane was 42 years old, a widow whose husband, a railroad foreman named Joseph Crane, had been killed in a derailment outside of Harrisburg 6 years earlier. She had come to Millstone after his death, seeking a smaller community with lower costs of living, and had established herself as a seamstress of considerable skill. Her specialty was mourning clothes, the black dresses, veils, armbands, and ribbons that 19th-century American society required of its grieving members. She worked out of a rented room on Water Street, 2 blocks from the funeral home, and she and Eleanor had developed a professional relationship that had gradually deepened into friendship. It was Lydia who sewed the linings for the coffins when families requested them. It was Lydia who altered the burial clothes when the deceased had gained or lost weight before their final fitting. It was Lydia who sat with Eleanor in the back room of the funeral home on quiet afternoons, the 2 women working in companionable silence, their needles moving through black fabric while the bodies waited in the next room for their appointments with eternity. On the afternoon of October the 8th, Lydia arrived at the funeral home to deliver a set of mourning veils for a family that had lost their eldest daughter to scarlet fever. The front door was unlocked, but the parlor was empty. She called Eleanor's name and received no response. She walked through the hallway toward the back room where she and Eleanor usually sat, and as she passed the desk where Eleanor kept the account books, she noticed a sheet of paper that had fallen to the floor, half hidden beneath the leg of the chair. She picked it up. It was not an invoice or a letter. It was a list written in Silas Mercer's careful hand on a sheet of paper that had been torn from a pocket notebook. The list contained 12 items, arranged in what appeared to be chronological order. Notify Reverend Carver. Do not specify time. Close house to visitors for 2 full days. No inspection of body after placement in coffin. Seal lid before arrival of any family or clergy. Arrange pallbearers. 4, not 6. Burial before 8 in the morning. No viewing. Closed coffin throughout. Gravedigger. To prepare plot 47. Remove display coffin from window night before. Cancel all scheduled appointments for the week. Notify Dr. Whitaker after the fact. File certificate without delay. Lydia read the list twice, then a 3rd time. The handwriting was unmistakable. The instructions were specific, and the final notation, written in the margin beside the last item, was a single sentence that made her hands go cold. Eleanor will not survive the winter, and this must be done with dignity. She folded the paper and placed it in the pocket of her dress. When Eleanor appeared a few minutes later, looking tired and pale, Lydia said nothing about what she had found. She delivered the veils, accepted a cup of tea, and listened as Eleanor talked about the funeral scheduled for the following day. A miner who had died of lung disease, his widow unable to pay for the coffin Silas had already ordered. As Eleanor spoke, Lydia watched her friend's hands shake as she lifted the teacup to her lips. She noticed the half-empty bottle of Dr. Whitaker's tonic on the shelf above the desk. She observed the way Eleanor paused mid-sentence, as though she had forgotten what she was saying, her eyes losing focus for a moment before snapping back to attention. When Lydia left the funeral home that evening, she did not go directly to her room on Water Street. Instead, she walked to the Presbyterian Cemetery on the Eastern Ridge and found plot 47, a rectangular patch of earth in the shaded section near the old stone wall. Someone had already driven a wooden stake into the ground at the head of the plot. A number had been painted on the stake in black ink, the number 47. The grave had not yet been dug, but the grass around the stake had been trampled flat, as though someone had been pacing there for some time. Lydia returned to the funeral home the following week, under the pretense of discussing a new order of black ribbon. She found Eleanor alone in the back room, Sorting through a stack of burial permits that required her signature, the two women sat together as they had done dozens of times before, the afternoon light filtering through the dusty window, the smell of formaldehyde drifting in from the embalming room, the muted sounds of Bridge Street filtering through the walls. Eleanor spoke first. Her voice was lower than usual, as though she feared being overheard. "He prepares my tea now," she said. "Every morning and every evening he insists on mixing the powder himself. He says the doctor's instructions are very specific about the dosage." Lydia asked if Eleanor had noticed any pattern in her episodes of drowsiness. Eleanor was silent for a long moment. She set down the pen and rubbed her temples with both hands, a gesture of exhaustion that had become habitual in recent months. "They always come after the tea," she said finally, "about 20 minutes after. The morning dose makes me sleep until noon. The evening dose sometimes keeps me unconscious until dawn. I wake up and I cannot remember what I did the day before. I cannot remember conversations. I cannot remember signing papers." She looked at Lydia, and for the first time there was something other than fatigue in her eyes. It was fear, carefully controlled but unmistakable. "He brings me documents," she continued, "papers that need my signature. He says they are routine, contracts with suppliers, burial permits, correspondence with the county, but when I try to read them I cannot focus on the words. The letters swim together, and Silas is always there, telling me it is all right, telling me just to sign and rest, that he will explain everything later." Lydia asked what documents Eleanor had signed in recent weeks. Eleanor shook her head. "I do not know. I cannot remember. But there was one. I saw it on his desk the next morning, before he could hide it. It was a transfer of property, the funeral home, the carriage house, the inventory, all of it, signed over to Silas, to be effective upon my death or incapacitation." She paused. Her hands were shaking again. "There was another one, a medical authorization. It gives Silas the authority to make decisions about my treatment if I am declared incapable of making them myself. Dr. Whitaker's signature is already on it." Lydia removed the folded list from her pocket and placed it on the table between them. She did not explain where she had found it. She simply watched Eleanor's face as she read the 12 items, one by one, and the sentence written in the margin. Eleanor did not weep. She did not cry out or call for help. She simply folded the paper and handed it back to Lydia, her expression settling into something harder than grief. "He has already told half the town that I will not survive the winter," she said quietly. "I have heard him. At first I thought it was worry. Now I understand it is planning." Lydia asked what Eleanor intended to do. For a long moment, Eleanor did not answer. She sat motionless in her chair, the burial permits forgotten, the afternoon light beginning to fade outside the window. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I am going to collect evidence," she said, "and I am going to need your help." The arrangement they established was simple and dangerous. Eleanor would pretend to continue taking the full doses of the tonic, but she would set aside a portion of each dose in small glass vials that Lydia provided, the kind of vials used for perfume samples, easily concealed in a pocket or a sewing basket. She would attempt to read every document Silas placed before her, and if she could not read them, she would make a show of compliance, while secretly setting the papers aside for Lydia to examine later. She would document her symptoms in a diary that Lydia would keep at her room on Water Street, away from the funeral home and its prying eyes. The vials began to accumulate. By the end of October, Lydia had collected 14 of them, each containing a small amount of the powdered tonic that Silas mixed into his wife's tea. The diary recorded a pattern that was impossible to dismiss. The episodes of drowsiness, confusion, and memory loss occurred exclusively after the administration of the tonic, and the severity of the symptoms increased when Silas prepared the doses himself rather than allowing Eleanor to measure them. But it was the documents that revealed the full scope of the scheme. Using her position as Eleanor's confidant, Lydia began to examine the account books and burial records that Eleanor managed. At first, she was looking for evidence of the property transfers and medical authorizations. What she found instead was a pattern of fraud so extensive and so audacious that it took her breath away. The Mercer Funeral Home, by all outward appearances, was a prosperous business. Silas charged premium prices for his services, and the families of Millstone paid them, often sacrificing their savings to ensure that their loved ones received a dignified burial. The coffins were the centerpiece of the sales pitch, handcrafted from oak or walnut, lined with satin, fitted with brass handles and engraved nameplates. Silas spoke of them as works of art, permanent tributes to the deceased, investments in eternal memory. But the account books told a different story. By cross-referencing the invoices issued to families with the actual burial permits filed with the county, Lydia discovered that Silas had been selling the same coffins multiple times. A walnut coffin sold to the Patterson family in March of 1867, for example, had been invoiced again to the Kowalski family in September of the same year. A maple coffin commissioned by the Harris widow in January of 1868 had reappeared in the records 5 months later, sold to a mill foreman named Buckley for the burial of his youngest son. The method, once Lydia understood it, was chillingly simple. After each funeral, Silas would wait until nightfall. Then he and the gravedigger, a man named Orville Finch, whose complicity was documented in a series of payments recorded in the margins of the account books, would return to the cemetery. They would dig down to the freshly buried coffin, open the grave, and extract the body. The corpse would be transferred to a simple pine box, which would be returned to the grave and covered over. The expensive coffin would be taken back to the funeral home, where it would be cleaned, relined, and prepared for the next customer. The families never knew. The graves appeared undisturbed, the headstones remained in place, and Silas Mercer collected payment after payment for coffins that were never truly sold, merely rented for the brief interval between the funeral and the darkness that followed. Eleanor had discovered the scheme in July of 1868, when a discrepancy in the inventory records had led her to question why the funeral home consistently ordered fewer coffins from the supplier in Philadelphia than it invoiced to the families of Millstone. She had confronted Silas in the embalming room, the account book spread before her on the porcelain table where the dead were prepared for their final appointments. She had told him that what he was doing was not merely fraud, it was desecration. She had threatened to take the books to the county magistrate in Brookville and to provide a full accounting of every illegal burial he had conducted. That conversation had occurred on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Eleanor's episodes of weakness had intensified. By the following Monday, Dr. Whitaker had adjusted his diagnosis and prescribed the new tonic. And by the end of the month, Silas had begun telling the neighbors that his wife would not survive the winter. The connection was not difficult to make. What Lydia could not yet prove was the link between Dr. Whitaker and the scheme. The doctor's complicity appeared to be limited to the medical authorization and the convenient diagnosis of Eleanor's condition. But the question remained: why would a respected physician, a man who had served the community for more than 20 years, lend his credibility to an undertaker's attempt to poison his own wife? The answer arrived on the afternoon of October the 25th, hidden inside the coffin that waited in the front window. Lydia had come to the funeral home that day under the pretense of measuring the lining of the display coffin, a task that Eleanor had assigned to her as a way of granting her access to the premises. Silas was out, attending a burial at the Catholic cemetery on the western edge of town. The funeral home was empty, except for Eleanor, who was resting upstairs, and the silent clientele in the embalming room. Lydia worked quickly. She opened the lid of the display coffin and examined the interior, noting the quality of the walnut, the craftsmanship of the joints, the careful stitching of the satin lining. It was, by any measure, a beautiful piece of work. The kind of coffin that would command a premium price from a grieving family who wanted to believe that their loved one would rest in luxury for all eternity. As she ran her fingers along the interior of the lid, she felt something beneath the satin, a slight irregularity no larger than a folded sheet of paper. She pressed down on the fabric and confirmed that something was hidden between the lining and the wood. It took her several minutes to extract it without tearing the satin. The object was a letter, folded into a tight square and wedged behind a seam in the lining. The paper was of good quality, cream-colored and heavy, the kind used by professional men for professional correspondence. The handwriting was not Silas Mercer's. The letter was addressed to Silas and bore the signature of Dr. Amos Whitaker. It was dated September the 3rd, 5 days before the coffin had appeared in the front window. The text was brief and businesslike, the language of two men who had reached an understanding that neither wished to state directly. Regarding our discussion of the 15th ultimo, I have considered the arrangement you proposed and find the terms acceptable, provided certain conditions are met. I will attend your wife as her physician of record and will not seek consultation with any other practitioner. When you inform me that she has ceased to respond to treatment, I will attend promptly and issue the necessary certificate without conducting a full examination. The cause of death will be recorded as failure of the nervous system secondary to exhaustion, which will satisfy the county registrar and the cemetery board. In exchange, I will receive 20% of the proceeds from the sale of the funeral home and the 2 parcels of land on the eastern ridge that are registered in your wife's name. I trust that you will honor this agreement in the same spirit of professional courtesy in which I have accepted it. One final matter. The sedative I have prepared for your use is derived from a formula used in surgical procedures at the Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia. It is effective, but must be administered with care. 3 grains in the morning dose and 4 in the evening should produce the desired appearance of natural decline. Should you require a more rapid resolution, a single dose of 8 grains will produce a state sufficiently deep to satisfy any cursory examination. I trust you will exercise discretion in this matter. I remain your obedient servant in this and all professional undertakings. Dr. Amos Whitaker, physician and surgeon, Millstone, Pennsylvania. Lydia read the letter 5 times, her hands trembling as she held the paper. When she finally looked up, Eleanor was standing in the doorway of the parlor, her face pale and expressionless. "I found it 3 days ago," Eleanor said. "I was going to tell you tonight." Lydia asked why she had not gone directly to the sheriff. Eleanor walked slowly across the room and sat down in the chair beside the empty coffin. She looked small and fragile against the dark wood, a woman who had been reduced by months of poisoning to a shadow of her former self. "Because I wanted to be certain," she said, "because I wanted to have everything. The vials, the documents, the account books, and the letter, before I took them to the authorities. I did not want there to be any room for doubt. I did not want Silas to be able to explain any of it away." She looked at the coffin, at the brass nameplate that bore her name, at the satin lining that had been measured to fit her body. "He has been planning this since July," she said. "Since the moment I told him I knew about the coffins, he and Dr. Whitaker and Orville Finch. They have been dividing the profits among themselves for years, and when I threatened to expose them, they decided that the simplest solution was to remove me from the equation. Lydia asked about Orville Finch, the gravedigger. Eleanor nodded. He is the one who digs up the coffins, he is the one who transfers the bodies, and he is the one who was supposed to dig my grave. The plan that Lydia and Eleanor developed over the following days was not a plan for escape. Eleanor was too weak to travel, and Silas watched her too closely for any sudden departure to go unnoticed. Instead, they prepared for the confrontation they both knew was coming. Eleanor continued to set aside portions of her tonic, building a collection of evidence that now filled a small wooden box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Lydia's room on Water Street. She gathered copies of the account books, the burial permits, and the property transfer documents. She wrote a detailed statement describing her symptoms, her discovery of the fraud, and her husband's subsequent behavior. She signed it in the presence of Lydia and a notary public in the neighboring town of Ridgeway, a journey she made on a day when Silas was occupied with a funeral in Brookville. The notary, a man named Charles Porter, asked no questions about the nature of the document. He simply witnessed the signatures, applied his seal, and collected his fee. But as Eleanor and Lydia were leaving his office, he mentioned that his brother-in-law worked as a deputy in the sheriff's office in Brookville, and that if any legal matters should arise, he would be happy to make an introduction. Lydia filed this information away for future reference. October gave way to November, and the weather turned cold. The leaves fell from the trees on the eastern ridge. The smoke from the foundries hung low over Millstone, mixing with the morning fog to create a perpetual twilight. In the front window of the funeral home, the display coffin remained in place, the brass nameplate catching what little light managed to penetrate the gloom. On the morning of November the 3rd, Eleanor Mercer did not come downstairs to open the account books. Silas informed the neighbors who inquired that his wife had taken a turn for the worse during the night. Dr. Whitaker had been summoned and was attending her now. The prognosis was guarded. Prayers would be appreciated. Throughout the day, a small procession of visitors came to the funeral home, offering their condolences and their assistance. Silas accepted both with the same grave courtesy he extended to all his clients. He spoke of Eleanor in the past tense, as though she had already departed. He mentioned that the funeral arrangements were in order, and that the service would be small and private, in accordance with Eleanor's wishes. None of this was true. Eleanor had not expressed any wishes regarding her funeral. She had not taken a turn for the worse. She had simply lost consciousness after drinking her evening tea, a dose that Silas had prepared personally with particular care. At 7 o'clock in the evening, Dr. Whitaker emerged from the upstairs bedroom and announced that Eleanor Mercer had died. The cause, he said, was failure of the nervous system secondary to exhaustion, exactly as he had promised in his letter. He had already completed the death certificate. The body was being prepared for burial. Silas immediately closed the funeral home to visitors. The body, he explained, was not in a condition to be viewed. The coffin would remain closed throughout the proceedings. The burial would take place the following morning at 7 o'clock, before the town had fully awakened. These arrangements were unusual, but not unprecedented. Millstone had seen its share of disfiguring deaths, foundry accidents, mill fires, the occasional violence that flared up in the boarding houses on payday. Closed coffin funerals were not uncommon, and early burials were sometimes requested by families who wished to avoid the spectacle of public grief. No one questioned Silas's decisions except a single person, the employee of the boarding house on Water Street, a woman named Margaret Dunn, who had been watching the funeral home all day. Margaret was 23 years old, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had come to Pennsylvania to work in the coal fields and had died there, leaving their only child to find her own way in the world. She worked as a maid and cook at the boarding house, where Lydia Crane rented her room. And in the months since Lydia had begun investigating Silas Mercer, Margaret had become an unlikely ally. She had carried messages between Lydia and Eleanor when direct contact was impossible. She had watched the funeral home during the nights when Lydia feared that Silas might accelerate his timetable. She had listened to the gossip in the boarding house dining room, collecting fragments of information about the Undertaker and his increasingly strange behavior. On the evening of November the 3rd, Margaret was standing at the window of the boarding house kitchen when she saw Dr. Whittaker leave the funeral home. She watched him walk down Bridge Street toward his own house, his medical bag swinging at his side, his pace unhurried. She noted the time, 7 minutes past 7. 20 minutes later, she saw Silas Mercer emerge from the side door of the funeral home, carrying a lantern. He walked to the carriage house and returned a few moments later with the hearse, its black curtains drawn, its silver trim catching the light of the street lamps. He backed the hearse up to the rear entrance of the funeral home, the entrance that connected directly to the embalming room, and then he disappeared inside. Margaret left her post at the window and ran upstairs to Lydia's room. Lydia was already dressed for the outdoors, a heavy wool cloak over her black dress, the wooden box of evidence tucked under her arm. She had been expecting this moment for weeks. She had prepared for it. But the reality of it, the knowledge that Eleanor was now inside that building, unconscious or worse, being prepared for a coffin that had been waiting for her since September, was almost more than she could bear. She handed Margaret a sealed envelope and told her to deliver it to the sheriff's office in Brookville, 12 miles to the east. The envelope contained a summary of the evidence, the notarized statement from Eleanor, and a letter from Lydia herself, addressed to Sheriff Matthew Harlan, explaining the situation in detail and requesting his immediate intervention. Margaret asked if she should take the night coach. Lydia shook her head. The night coach would not arrive in Brookville until dawn. Instead, she directed Margaret to the livery stable at the south end of Bridge Street, where a horse and rider could be hired for the journey. The stable owner, a man named Jeremiah Cole, owed Lydia a favor from the time she had sewn burial clothes for his mother without charging for the labor. He would provide a horse without asking questions. Margaret left the boarding house through the rear entrance, the envelope concealed beneath her cloak. She would reach Brookville shortly after 10 o'clock. The sheriff would need time to assemble his deputies, to review the evidence, to make the 12-mile journey back to Millston. If everything went according to plan, they would arrive before dawn. Lydia, meanwhile, walked to the funeral home. She did not knock on the front door. She circled around to the side entrance, the one that Eleanor used to enter and leave without passing through the public parlor. The door was unlocked. Silas, in his haste, had forgotten to secure it. The interior of the funeral home was dark, lit only by the lantern that Silas had carried to the carriage house. Lydia moved through the familiar rooms, the parlor with its display of mourning goods, the hallway with its framed certificates and testimonials, the back room where she and Eleanor had spent so many afternoons working together in silence. She passed the desk where Eleanor had kept the account books, now bare and empty, the documents presumably secured elsewhere. She passed the chair where she had sat on the day she found the list of 12 items, the list that had confirmed her worst suspicions. The embalming room door was closed. From beneath it, a thin line of light was visible. Lydia did not open the door. She knew that Silas was inside, preparing the body, arranging the coffin, completing the final steps of his long and meticulous plan. She knew that confronting him directly would accomplish nothing except to alert him to her presence. Instead, she positioned herself in the shadows of the hallway and waited. At 8:30, a knock sounded at the front door. Silas emerged from the embalming room, wiping his hands on a cloth, and walked to the parlor. Through the crack in the hallway door, Lydia could hear him speaking to someone, a man's voice, deep and familiar. It was the gravedigger, Orville Finch, come to confirm the arrangements for the morning. The two men spoke in low tones, their words indistinct. After a few minutes, Finch departed, and Silas returned to the embalming room. Lydia remained in the hallway, her back pressed against the wall, her breathing shallow and controlled. At 9 o'clock, she made her way upstairs to the bedroom that Silas and Eleanor had shared. The room was tidy and impersonal, the bed made, the curtains drawn. On the nightstand, she found what she was looking for, the bottle of Dr. Whittaker's tonic, now nearly empty, and beside it, the measuring spoon that Silas used to portion out the doses. She placed both items in the pocket of her cloak. In the wardrobe, she found Eleanor's personal papers, letters from her family in Ohio, a small Bible that had belonged to her mother, a daguerreotype of her parents taken on their wedding day. She gathered them together, knowing that Eleanor would want them if she survived. Downstairs, the embalming room door opened again. Silas walked through the hallway and into the parlor, carrying a small wooden case. Through the crack in the door, Lydia could see him arranging items on the display table. The guest book for mourners to sign, a stack of memorial cards, the black ribbon that would be tied to the door to signify a death in the household. He was preparing the funeral home for the morning service with the same methodical attention to detail that he applied to all his undertakings. When he returned to the embalming room, Lydia slipped out of the house through the side entrance and walked back to the boarding house on Water Street. She had seen enough. She knew that Eleanor was in the embalming room, that the coffin was closed, and that the burial was scheduled for 7 o'clock in the morning. She also knew that Sheriff Harlan would not arrive until just before dawn. 6 hours remained, 6 hours in which anything could happen. At the boarding house, Lydia did not sleep. She sat in her room, the wooden box of evidence on the table before her, and waited for the hours to pass. She reviewed every document. She rehearsed every argument. She prepared herself for the possibility that the sheriff would dismiss her claims as the fantasies of an overwrought widow, that Silas would succeed in burying his wife, that the truth would be interred along with Eleanor beneath the soil of Plot 47. At 4:15 in the morning, a horse and wagon stopped outside the boarding house. Margaret Dunn had returned from Brookville, and she had brought Sheriff Matthew Harlan with her. Sheriff Harlan was a large man, 53 years old, with a thick grey mustache and the weary eyes of someone who had spent his career dealing with the unglamorous crimes of rural Pennsylvania. Public drunkenness, petty theft, the occasional barroom brawl. He was not accustomed to being summoned in the middle of the night to prevent a premature burial, and his initial skepticism was evident in the way he examined Lydia's evidence. Turning over the vials of tonic, squinting at the account books, reading Dr. Whittaker's letter with the expression of a man who could not quite believe what he was seeing. But the evidence was compelling. The notarized statement from Eleanor was particularly effective. Sheriff Harlan had known Charles Porter, the notary in Ridgeway, for more than 20 years, and the man's seal on a document was as good as a sworn affidavit. If Eleanor Mercer had signed a statement describing her husband's crimes in the presence of a notary, then there was sufficient cause to investigate. Sheriff Harlan asked whether Eleanor was still alive. Lydia could only answer that she did not know. The last time she had seen Eleanor was 2 days earlier, when the woman was still conscious but growing weaker by the hour. According to Dr. Whittaker, she had died at 7 o'clock the previous evening, but Dr. Whittaker's credibility was now in serious doubt, and his letter made clear that he had been prepared to issue a death certificate without conducting a thorough examination. The sheriff made his decision. He would accompany Lydia to the cemetery and intercept the burial before it could take place. He deputized Margaret Dunn as a temporary witness and instructed her to follow at a distance in case additional testimony was required. Then he and Lydia walked through the dark streets of Millstone toward the Presbyterian Cemetery on the eastern ridge. The sun had not yet risen when they arrived. The sky was a deep grey, the colour of slate, with a thin line of pale light visible on the horizon. The cemetery was shrouded in fog, the headstones emerging from the mist like the prows of sunken ships, and near the old stone wall, in the shaded section where Plot 47 had been reserved, a small procession was assembling. Silas Mercer stood beside the open grave, dressed in his finest black suit, his pale hands folded before him. Beside him was Orville Finch, the gravedigger, leaning on his shovel with the casual posture of a man who had just completed a routine task. The hearse was parked nearby, its curtains still drawn. The coffin, the same walnut coffin that had been displayed in the front window, the brass nameplate catching the first light of dawn, had been unloaded and placed on a wooden bier at the edge of the grave. Reverend Carver, the Presbyterian minister, stood at the head of the coffin, his prayer book open, his voice murmuring the familiar words of the burial service. There were no mourners. There were no pallbearers. There was only the fog, the silence, and the monotonous drone of the Reverend's prayer. Sheriff Harlan did not announce himself until he was standing at the edge of the grave. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I need you to open that coffin." Silas turned slowly, his pale eyes registering no surprise at the interruption. He regarded the sheriff with the same calm courtesy he extended to all visitors, as though a lawman appearing at a burial at 5 o'clock in the morning were a perfectly ordinary occurrence. "Sheriff Harlan," he said, "this is a private service. I must ask you to respect the family's wishes." Sheriff Harlan repeated his request. "Open the coffin." Silas glanced at Reverend Carver, who had stopped reading but kept his prayer book open, apparently uncertain whether the interruption constituted a temporary pause or a permanent adjournment. Then he turned back to the sheriff. "The body is not prepared for viewing," he said. "My wife suffered greatly in her final hours. The dignity of the deceased must be preserved." Lydia stepped forward from behind the sheriff. Her voice was clear and steady. "The dignity of the deceased," she said, "would be better served if the deceased were actually dead." For the first time, something flickered across Silas Mercer's face. Not fear, not guilt. Something closer to irritation. The annoyance of a craftsman whose work was being criticized by someone who did not understand the trade. Sheriff Harlan repeated his request for the third time, and this time he placed his hand on the handle of his revolver. Silas did not move. Orville Finch, however, took a step backward, away from the coffin, away from the grave, away from the sheriff whose hand was resting on a weapon. The gravedigger was a follower, not a leader, and the situation had shifted beyond the comfortable boundaries of his usual criminality. It was Reverend Carver who broke the stalemate. He closed his prayer book and stepped away from the coffin, positioning himself at a neutral distance between the sheriff and the Undertaker. He said that if there was any doubt about the circumstances of Eleanor Mercer's death, it would be a sin to proceed with the burial. He said that the living must take precedence over the dead. He said that he would not preside over a funeral that might in fact be a murder. Silas looked at the Reverend. He looked at the sheriff. He looked at Lydia Crane, whose face was pale and set with determination. Then he reached into his pocket and produced a small key, which he used to unlock the brass latches on the lid of the coffin. The lid swung open. Eleanor Mercer lay inside, dressed in a simple black gown, her hands folded across her chest, her hair arranged around her face with careful precision. Her skin was pale. Her lips were slightly parted. Her eyes were closed. She looked, by any conventional measure, exactly like a dead woman prepared for burial. But as the fog drifted across the open coffin and the first rays of sunlight touched her face, a single finger on her right hand twitched. Sheriff Harlan leaned forward and pressed 2 fingers to her neck, feeling for a pulse. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The gravedigger shifted uneasily. The Reverend murmured something that might have been a prayer. Silas Mercer stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, his expression unreadable. After what seemed like a very long time, the sheriff straightened up. "She is alive," he said. "Barely, but alive." He turned to face Silas Mercer, and when he spoke again, his voice was no longer the weary tone of a rural lawman dealing with a routine dispute. It was the voice of a man who had just looked into an open grave and seen something he would never forget. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "you are under arrest." The trial of Silas Mercer, Dr. Amos Whitaker, and Orville Finch was conducted in the county courthouse in Brookville during the spring of 1869. It attracted considerable attention from the newspapers in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, both of which dispatched correspondents to cover the proceedings. The case was variously described as the Millstone Coffin Conspiracy and the Undertaker's Plot, and the details that emerged during the testimony only intensified the public's morbid fascination. Eleanor Mercer survived. She was transported to a hospital in Pittsburgh, where a second physician, a Dr. Samuel Thornton, conducted a thorough examination and concluded that she had been subjected to prolonged administration of a sedative agent, likely derived from opium or a related compound, in doses sufficient to produce a state of profound unconsciousness that could, in a cursory examination, be mistaken for death. Dr. Thornton's testimony at the trial was damning. The sedative had been administered consistently over a period of months, and the dose administered on the night of November the 3rd had been large enough to produce a coma that would likely have been fatal within another 12 to 24 hours. Eleanor did not testify in person. She provided a written deposition, read aloud in court by the magistrate, that described her discovery of the coffin fraud, her confrontation with her husband, and the subsequent deterioration of her health. The deposition was precise and controlled, a document that had clearly been composed with care. It did not express anger. It did not express grief. It simply stated the facts in chronological order and allowed the facts to speak for themselves. The letter from Dr. Whitaker was introduced as evidence. The vials of tonic were introduced as evidence. The account books and burial permits were introduced as evidence, their pages marked with notations that showed the same coffins being sold again and again, the payments divided among the 3 conspirators. The list of 12 items that Lydia had found beneath the desk was introduced as evidence, along with her testimony about the circumstances of its discovery. The trial revealed a network of fraud that extended far beyond the attempted murder of Eleanor Mercer. Over the course of 3 days, 47 families came forward to testify that they had purchased coffins from Silas Mercer in the past 5 years. When the graves were examined, discreetly with the permission of the county, the bodies of 31 of those deceased individuals were found to be interred in simple pine boxes rather than the expensive coffins for which their families had paid. Orville Finch, the gravedigger, turned state's evidence. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he provided a detailed account of the scheme. He described the nighttime excavations, the transfer of bodies from one coffin to another, the cleaning and relining of the reclaimed coffins. He described the payments he had received, which amounted to $5 per coffin. He described the night of November the 3rd, when Silas had instructed him to dig the grave for Eleanor and to be ready to backfill it before 8 o'clock in the morning, before anyone in Millstone was awake enough to notice. Dr. Whitaker, for his part, maintained his innocence until the end. He claimed that the letter was a forgery, that the tonic was a legitimate medical treatment, that Eleanor's symptoms were consistent with the nervous condition he had diagnosed. But the handwriting on the letter was verified by 3 independent experts, and the formula for the sedative was found in his medical journals, recorded in his own hand. He was convicted on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 15 years in the state penitentiary. Silas Mercer was convicted on charges of attempted murder, fraud, and desecration of graves. The sentence handed down by the judge was life imprisonment, a term that reflected not only the severity of his crimes, but also the horror that his profession had inspired in the community. An undertaker who consorted with the dead was one thing. An undertaker who tried to add his own wife to the client list was something else entirely. He was transported to the Western Penitentiary outside of Pittsburgh, where he lived for another 12 years, working in the prison carpentry shop and refusing all requests for interviews. He died there in 1881 of tuberculosis and was buried in the prison cemetery in an unmarked grave. Orville Finch served 3 years of a reduced sentence and was released in 1872. He left Pennsylvania immediately and was never heard from again. Dr. Whitaker served 11 years of his 15-year sentence before being released on parole in 1880. He returned to Millstone, where he attempted to resume his medical practice. The attempt was unsuccessful. The residents of the town made it clear that his services were no longer required, and after 6 months of empty waiting rooms and hostile glances, he relocated to a small town in Indiana, where he lived out the remainder of his life in obscurity. Lydia Crane continued to live in Millstone, running her seamstress business from the same room on Water Street. She received a portion of the recovered proceeds from the coffin fraud, a modest sum that the court awarded to her in recognition of her role in exposing the conspiracy. She never remarried. She never spoke publicly about the case, preferring to let the court records speak for themselves. In her later years, she was known in Millstone as a woman of quiet dignity and formidable competence, a person who could be relied upon in a crisis and trusted with the most delicate of tasks. Eleanor Mercer did not return to Millstone after her recovery. She spent several months in Pittsburgh, regaining her strength and her clarity of mind, and then, in the spring of 1870, she left Pennsylvania entirely. She traveled west to a small town in Ohio where her younger sister lived with her husband and children. She changed her name legally, reverting to her maiden name of Caldwell, and she took a position as a bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant in the town of Lancaster, Ohio. She never remarried. She never spoke of her previous life. The few acquaintances she made in Lancaster knew her only as Eleanor Caldwell, a quiet woman of 40 who kept to herself and performed her duties with quiet efficiency. If any of them suspected that she carried a history of extraordinary horror, they never mentioned it, and she never offered to share it. She did, however, keep one reminder of her past. When she left Pennsylvania, she took with her a single object, the brass nameplate that had been affixed to the coffin in the front window of the funeral home. It bore her name in the formal serif lettering that Silas Mercer reserved for his most expensive commissions. Eleanor Mercer. She kept it in a small wooden box, along with a copy of the deposition she had provided to the court, a photograph of her parents, and a letter from Lydia Crane expressing the hope that she would find peace in her new life. The nameplate was never displayed. It remained in the box, wrapped in a piece of black velvet, for the remainder of Eleanor's life. When she died in 1903, at the age of 69, the box was found among her possessions. The executor of her estate, a nephew who had never met her but had corresponded with her occasionally, opened the box and discovered its contents. He read the deposition. He examined the nameplate. He tried to imagine the life his aunt had lived before she came to Lancaster, and found that he could not. The nephew kept the box for a time, uncertain what to do with it. Eventually, he donated the deposition to the Historical Society of Fairfield County, Ohio, where it was catalogued under the heading Personal Papers, Miscellaneous, and filed away in a storage room. The nameplate he kept for himself, a strange and uncomfortable memento of an aunt he had never known. As for the funeral home in Millstone, it stood vacant for 3 years after Silas Mercer's conviction. The building was considered tainted, its history too dark for any legitimate business to occupy. In 1872, it was purchased at auction by a family from Pittsburgh who intended to renovate it into a dry goods store. The renovation was never completed. The workers who were hired to strip the interior reported strange occurrences, unexplained sounds, sudden drops in temperature, the persistent smell of formaldehyde that could not be eliminated no matter how thoroughly the rooms were cleaned. The project was abandoned after 6 months. The building remained empty for another 2 decades, slowly decaying, its front window still bearing the faint outline where the display coffin had stood. In 1894, it was finally demolished to make way for a new road that would connect Millstone to the county seat in Brookville. And it was during the demolition that the final evidence of Silas Mercer's crimes was discovered. The workers who were tearing down the walls of the embalming room found them first, a collection of brass nameplates wedged into a narrow cavity between the interior wall and the exterior brick. There were dozens of them, stacked one on top of another like the pages of a book, each one engraved with a different name. The workers laid them out on the ground and counted 43 plates in total, each corresponding to a person whose family had purchased a coffin from Silas Mercer. The plates had been removed from the coffins before they were reclaimed and resold. The families had been charged for the engraving, but the plates themselves had never been affixed to the burial cases. Instead, they had been hidden in the walls, a secret archive of Silas Mercer's betrayal, preserved in brass and hidden from view. The plates were turned over to the local authorities, who attempted to match them with the burial records. Most of the families had long since left Millstone or died themselves, and the effort was eventually abandoned. The plates were stored in the basement of the county courthouse in Brookville, where they remained for half a century, forgotten and ignored. In 1947, a courthouse clerk named Arthur Bell, who was cataloguing old records in preparation for a renovation, discovered the box of nameplates in a forgotten corner of the basement. He spent several weeks researching the names, cross-referencing them with old newspapers and burial records, and eventually pieced together enough of the story to write an article for the Brookville Gazette. The article, titled "The Coffin Conspiracy of Millstone," was published on October the 31st, 1947, 79 years after the events it described. The article attracted little attention. Millstone had become a ghost town by then, its foundries closed, its population scattered. The Presbyterian cemetery on the eastern ridge was overgrown and neglected. Plot 47, the shaded space near the old stone wall, had never been filled. The grave that Orville Finch had dug on the night of November the 3rd, 1868, remained empty. Eleanor Mercer's nameplate was not among the 43 plates found in the wall of the funeral home. It was, as the last known record indicated, still in her possession, carried with her to Ohio, kept in a wooden box, a silent testament to a death that had been planned but never completed, a burial that had been interrupted, a life that had been saved not by any authority or institution, but by the stubborn, courageous persistence of a friend who had refused to look away. The brass plate bearing her name, the plate that Silas Mercer had engraved with the same meticulous care he applied to all his work, remained with Eleanor until the end of her life. It was, according to the nephew who found it among her possessions, kept separately from her other belongings, wrapped in black velvet, that had been worn smooth by years of careful handling. She had never discarded it. She had never destroyed it. She had simply kept it, a tangible reminder of the moment when her husband had prepared her death with more precision than he had ever prepared any funeral, and of the moment when she had proven, against all his calculations, that she was not yet ready to be buried.